Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. And this week we are live to you from La Bella Italia. So please excuse the fact I'm a bit dark, but I wasn't able to pack the studio lights in my travel bag. Welcome to you wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest, Harry Freedman. I'll introduce Harry in just a moment. A little bit of housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. You do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. And as ever, we will try our best to get through as many of your questions as possible. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility. You can use this to send a message to all of the other people on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, we are recording this talk. It will appear on our website at milim.org.uk in the next couple of days. There you will find recordings of other past events. You'll also find details of our future program for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest this evening, Harry Freedman is a London-born writer. He writes about history, religion, and culture. He has a degree in Aramaic translation of the Bible from London University. His previous ventures have included running a whole food restaurant in Devon and running companies in property, construction, healthcare, and consultancy. He has been a chief executive in the voluntary sector, and he helps people to make the most of their careers. Beginning by writing academic articles and occasionally contributing to books, he began writing on his own and has since published several works, including titles about Leonard Cohen, Rabbi Louis Jacobs, the Bible, Talmud, and Kabbalah. His latest work is British Jews, this fine book, hope you can see that, which we will be talking about this evening. So, Harry, a warm welcome to Milim.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Now, tell us briefly about this book, and then we'll get into some detail.
Okay, so I was asked to write this book by my publisher. He had brought out a book 30 years ago or so called The Club, and that was a very, very successful book. It was a very sort of chatty, upbeat book about the British Jewish community. And it was basically conversations with Jews across the country, but really focused on the communal leaders and donors and philanthropists. And he said to me, I'd like you to, I don't want to do a follow-up, but I'd like another book which is in some way connected to the club, somehow shows people what the Jewish world is like today. So I'd like you to go off and talk to the donors and the philanthropists and the people who run the community and write a book. And I said, well, that's all very well, but it's not the same these days. The community these days is not the way it was. Yes, of course, the big wealthy families are still there, but they're not running the community. The community is being run these days by, a few wealthy people, but also a lot of ordinary people. It's changed. We have a much more democratic, much more open, and actually probably, I think, a much calmer community than we had when the club came out. So what I did was, this is all during the pandemic, which was both a blessing and a curse in many ways, obviously, but a blessing because it meant I could do all my interviews on Zoom, which meant I could get through a lot more in a day and write the book more quickly. But I spoke to people from across the community, across the country, across the organizations, secular Jews, frum Jews, people who had no awareness of their Judaism at all, Jews living in Cornwall, in Scotland, all over the place. And I put together a book, which is basically, I think, a snapshot of the community as it is today.
And how did you choose these people that you interviewed?
I had an idea of the sort of the cross section I wanted, and I either chose people who I felt had, I knew had something to say, were articulate and had something to say, or I chose people who were running organizations which I wanted to include in the book. It wasn't difficult to choose people. The problem was not choosing people. The problem was leaving people out. There were so many more people I could have had, and I know that however many people you have, we're talking to Jews, you get as many different points of view of the Jewish community as there are people you're speaking to. So I knew that the more I spoke to, the more complex the book would end up. I restricted my interviewees to 100. I thought that was enough. And yeah, it's on balance, I think I chose most of the time the right people.
Who's the book intended for?
That's a very good question. The publisher thought it was going to be a book that non-Jews wanted to read. I'm not sure he's right. I think it's obviously going to go down very well amongst Jews. We like reading about ourselves. We like talking about ourselves. Some non-Jews would read it. I think if it had come out before Corbyn, when being Jewish was a little bit more cool than it is perhaps today, when, you know, I think we've had too much media exposure recently. I think if it came out before Corbyn, it would have appealed to more non-Jews. I think these days it's mainly aimed at Jews.
Now, Corbyn comes up a lot in your book, and it's
Yeah.
interesting that you mentioned him so early on. So what was the impact of Corbyn on the community?
Well, of course, it's fading now. You know, when I wrote the book during the pandemic, it was still very, very raw, and there was a lot of anger in the community. He had both a positive and a negative effect. Obviously, had a negative effect because he upset a lot of people and divided a lot of people, because there were a lot of Jews, and we didn't necessarily get this from the Jewish media, but there were a lot of Jews who supported his politics and weren't that concerned about his attitude towards Israel, or didn't think he was in any way anti-Semitic, who were very offended by the fact that the Jewish community was upset by him. So that was one side. The other side was that it brought the Jewish community together. It brought the Jewish community together, most notably in the demonstration outside Parliament, the Enough is Enough demonstration, where 2,000 people protested. It was the first time that British Jews had got up and protested as British Jews about themselves, about what was happening to them. They'd protested in the past about Soviet Jewry. They protested in the past about Israel-Palestine. They never protested about being Jewish in Britain. So that was a big turning point, and that happened because of Corbyn. And in many ways, which we can talk about, it brought the community together. And I think it was actually a very interesting phenomenon. Now that it's gone or going, we can take a step back and look at it and say, this is the impact. It was yes, it was horrible at the time, but actually there were some good outcomes as well. So
do you feel these links are fading now, that the immediate threat has gone away?
Yeah, I think memories are fading. I think, you know, it's like every other media storm. It dies down. I think a lot of people are still very bruised by what happened. A lot of people are still very angry on both sides about the other sides. You know, those Jews. I mean, in the Labour Party, you had the Jewish Labour movement and Jewish, what was that called? Jewish Labour Voices
for Labour.
Voices for Labour. And you know, and neither side could see the other side's point of view. And I have a very good friend who I interviewed for the book, who's you know, very, very, very pro Corbyn, very much Jewish Voices for Labour, who was, you know, quite upset that people were thinking that if he as a Jew could support a man like Corbyn. He didn't see it like that. He saw the politics, and he didn't feel that the anti-Semitism was there. He felt that was something that was built up by the media.
Now, you've got these three themes on the cover of the book: confidence, maturity, and anxiety.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about those three themes and why those are the preeminent ideas you've come up with from what you've learned.
Yeah. Okay. So let me take them in order. So confidence. I grew up. You know, I'm of a certain age. I grew up in a very reserved Anglo-Jewish community. We didn't even call ourselves British Jewry. We were Anglo-Jewry, and we were reserved. We didn't stick our heads above the parapets. Our buildings were behind walls. We had billboards, posters outside the synagogues showing biblical verses like the churches did. We tried our hardest not to be seen. And that's changed. And that's changed for a lot of reasons. Probably the single most important change was the 1967 war. The first time I saw anybody wearing a kippah in the street was after the 1967 war. I saw a guy on a bicycle wearing a kippah, and I was amazed. You never saw this before. We became more confident as a community. The Soviet Jewry thing happened. Israel clearly was, you know, much more in the news. And then the Corbyn, for a whole lot of different reasons, we became more confident as a community. And in London, they built the JW3, which is the community centre, which is on a main road, proudly displaying its Judaism. You wouldn't have imagined that could have happened 30, 40, 50 years ago. It wasn't conceivable. In those days, Jews were quiet, reserved. We kept out of the limelight. And today, it's partly about identity politics. Everybody these days has to have an identity. Certainly, if you're in the younger generation, you have to have an identity. And those people who are Jewish, their identity is to be Jewish, and they're proud of their identity. So confidence is something that's the confidence that I'm talking about. Maturity, I think, is very interesting, because maturity, there are two things about our maturity as a community. One is that we are the oldest established minority in the country. A lot of other minorities have come since we first came 300 years ago, and those minorities, we have gone out of our way in recent years anyway to assist those minorities. For example, the CST, the Community Security Trust, run training courses for minority security groups, for Muslims and Hindus, other people who feel threatened. They run training courses. They help set up the Tel Mama initiative for the Muslims. We have learnt how to integrate into British society and retain our own identity, which is a tremendous challenge. We didn't always get it right. We didn't get it right in the early days. We've started to get it right. We're proud as Jews, and yet we are British as well, and that's the maturity. But there's another side to our maturity as well, which is that we are now one of the longest established Jewish communities in the world. Since the Shoah, the European communities were destroyed. There's still a few communities in Iraq and Persia were still there, but they've now disappeared. So we, as British Jews, have been a diaspora community longer than almost any other community in the world. Maybe not Switzerland, but we're certainly up there amongst the most mature, and that gives us a standing in the diaspora, which I don't think we necessarily make the most of. We have an understanding of how to live as Jews amongst non-Jews. We don't always take that out to other communities, but it's certainly there, and I think that's part of our maturity. And then the third aspect, the anxiety, is what we were talking about before, about Corbyn. It's all very well saying that Corbyn has gone and the threat has passed, but there are a lot of people who are still very anxious. We have security guards outside our schools and our synagogues and our communal institutions. Anxiety is there, and anxiety is, it's not going to go away. So we have these three facets, which I think help to explain what we are as Jews in Britain.
And your opening chapter is called The New Confidence.
Yeah.
And I suppose there is perhaps a risk in confidence, a risk of complacency. Do you think the anxiety is the sort of check and balance?
In a way, it is. Yeah, I think it is in a way. I mean, that confidence in the opening chapter is very much about although I talk about the enough is enough demonstration and the fact that British Jews were getting together to protest. That confidence really comes through in the 20-year-olds in the early 30s. They're the ones who are saying, and I heard this so many times when I was interviewing people, we're doing this because we're Jewish. In the old days, we did things, they didn't say this, I'm saying this. In the old days, we did things despite being Jewish. These days, they do things because they're Jewish. Being Jewish is part of their identity, and they're proud of it. So that confidence, which is there in the younger generation, I hope it lasts. I hope it will carry forward as they grow older. But it really is a defining feature of the community at the moment. There was an organization which sadly collapsed recently called SEDEC, and it was it went into the third world, and it ran aid projects in the third world. And it was a Jewish organization. It could have been run, the people who were in it could have done their work through Oxfam or through Médecins Sans Frontières or any of those. They didn't have to do it through an organization, but they did it through an organization because they were Jewish. And I think that's a really interesting defining feature of our community today.
Now, you've learned a great deal, and obviously you've written about many different facets of the community in the book. So maybe we can explore some of those in a little more detail. And one of the things I was very interested that you wrote about was the Jewish press, and particularly the Jewish Chronicle. So tell us a little bit about what you discovered.
Well, I think the Jewish press, like all printed press, are suffering because of the internet and social media. People don't buy printed newspapers the way they used to. The paper, in most households, the paper does not come through the door in the morning. And the Jewish the Jewish Chronicle is, I think, affected by that. There was a time, and I remember this very clearly, there was a time when the Jewish Chronicle was the glue that held the whole community together. It had little just snippets saying so and so was unwell and is now recovering well, or telling you just telling you facts about people's lives, assuming, it was probably the wrong assumption, assuming that everybody in the community knew each other, and that everybody was reading the Jewish Chronicle, and it was, if you like, the broadsheet, the thing which went up on the walls in the old days, telling people what was going on in the Jewish world. Now that's gone. That's gone because, as I say, because of what's happened to print media. The pages and pages of births and deaths and marriages in the Jewish Chronicle have disappeared almost. There's now, if you're lucky, half a page, and the announcements are spaced out so widely because they just haven't got enough. So the Jewish media has declined in its communal, as a communal glue, if you like. And I think that Jews in Britain are no longer turning to the media to find out about each other. We've got social media, we've got Facebook, we've got organizations that connect us, and the Jewish press, like any other press, really, is suffering because of the way times are changing.
I think you'd expressed some concerns about the independence of the.
Well, that's a whole other question, yeah, and that's not been resolved, or certainly I've not heard that it has. The Jewish Chronicle, there were two papers in London, the Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish News, and they both got into severe financial trouble during the pandemic because of the way things were. And they were bailed out. They thought they would merge. They didn't. In the end, they didn't merge. They were bailed out separately. And the Jewish Chronicle was bailed out by a group of people who we don't know where their money came from. We know that there are a number of non-Jews, including activists in the Conservative Party, who are now sitting on the board of the Jewish Chronicle. It's not transparent, and this is a Jewish community paper. And I find that a little bit worrying. The paper is not doing anything which worries me or anybody else, but this is a Jewish paper, and I don't like the idea that somehow it's being funded in a way which is not transparent.
How religiously observant are Britain's Jews?
It's interesting, isn't it? Less so than in the past. What we're doing is, what's happening is that we're polarizing. We have a growing Haredi community, growing largely because of the family sizes. We have a growing secular community, growing because that's what's happening in society in general. People are moving away from religion. And we have a center which spans sort of modern Orthodoxy, or maybe traditional Orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy, Masorti, Reform, and Liberal. That's the centre, which is shrinking because people are being pulled to either side. And yet, we all belong to synagogues, and we belong to synagogues because we want to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. And it's this idea that it's this idea of burial which has kept the Jewish community alive, ironically. The fact that people still want to, even have no interest in their Judaism at all, they want to be buried in a Jewish cemetery, which makes them join a synagogue. And very many non-observant people join Orthodox synagogues and call themselves Orthodox because they're members of Orthodox synagogues. It's a uniquely British thing. It's part of this whole British way of muddling through. They're not Orthodox. They call themselves Orthodox. That's fine. Nobody has a problem with that. But as a community, I think our religious observance has really polarized. We're either Haredi or nothing, with far fewer in the center.
You write about a rift in the community in the 1960s, which you claim has repercussions which continue to this day.
Yeah, I mean, the rift in the 1960s was the Jacobs affair, when Louis Jacobs was denied, thought he was going to be offered the principalship of Jews College, which was the premier rabbinic training college in Britain, and then because of a book he'd written some years earlier, which had only just been noticed by the chief rabbi, he was denied that post. And when he tried to go back to his old pulpit at the New West End Synagogue, the chief rabbi refused to let him go back. And that resulted in the membership of the New York Synagogue almost en masse resigning and setting up the New London Synagogue, which they set up as an independent Orthodox synagogue, but which later became the sort of the founding or the flagship synagogue for the Masorti movement. That was the rift. And I think that rift is still there, in as much as there are still events in the community. They don't happen so much these days, but they're still there in the memory. The whole Masorti movement is a result of that rift. The relationship between the Orthodox and non-Orthodox rabbis in many ways was influenced by that rift, because before then, you had organizations like the Association of Anglo-Jewish Preachers, where Reform and Orthodox rabbis would get together and meet and talk, and that has now gone. That you can no longer have an Orthodox rabbi and a Reform rabbi sitting on the same platform. The Council of Christians and Jews, which was just the chief rabbi, was the only Jewish vice president, even though there were several bishops. Now, as a result of that split, the Reform movement agitated to have their own vice president, and now there are several non-Orthodox vice presidents. All these things within the religious spectrum of the community have come about, I think, as a result of that rift. It's not necessarily, it's getting better, it is improving. Relationships between the various sides of the community are improving, and COVID ironically had a lot to do with that, because people had to, when I spoke to the chief executive of the liberal movement, she told me that she had, during COVID, the government's Home Office or whoever would call together the various religious groups for consultation or whatever, and they would sit around the table together, Haredi rabbis, Reform rabbis, liberal Orthodox rabbis, and they had to start a dialogue, and that dialogue has carried forward. The relationships between rabbis in different denominations are far better than they used to be. But I trace first of all the rift, and then the gradual drawing back together again, back to that period in 63, 64, when the Jacobs affair happened.
And were there other positive or negative outcomes from COVID besides the one you just mentioned?
Well, I think there's a big outcome from COVID, which is synagogue attendance. Obviously, the synagogue's closed, and most schools these days are saying that their attendance numbers have not come back to where they were. That may not be the case in the very frum synagogues, but elsewhere, a lot of people have not gone back to synagogue. They discovered, going to synagogue was their Shabbat morning experience since the day they were born. That's what they did. They discovered there were alternatives. They didn't have to go to synagogue. Masorti, Reform, liberals service movements started putting their services online. People could attend synagogue from home. So that was a negative consequence. The positive consequence, as I say, is a better dialogue between the community. But the negative consequence, I think, has really been the decline in synagogue attendance, which has a knock-on effect, because that then affects synagogue membership, which affects finances, and it rolls on from there.
Do we have a gender divide in the community?
Of course, we always had a gender divide in the community. It depends where you are on the spectrum. There is now the partnership minyanim are the Orthodox way of bringing men and women together in the synagogue in a way in which women can participate, maybe not as fully as men, but still more than they can in a traditional Orthodox synagogue. There are a lot of women in Orthodox synagogues who are resentful about effectively their second-class status, but they don't leave. And the reason they don't leave is because synagogue attendance is not so much about politics, it's about emotion. You go to an Orthodox synagogue because you grew up in an Orthodox synagogue, and you know the tunes and you know the people, and it's where you want to go. But you can still feel resentful if you're a woman at the fact that you can't participate, or you can't, or you have to sit separately. Now, many women are quite happy with that, but there's a growing movement of people who are not. And if you say to those people, well, why don't you leave and join Masorti? They say, why should I? This is my shul. Why should I go? So, yes, there is a gender divide.
Mm. Now, you write about the Haredi community, or perhaps more correctly, the Haredi communities, and maybe you'd explain why it's more than one community. But there are a couple of things that for me were quite disturbing. Firstly, how these communities can reject people if they don't toe the line. And secondly, how apparently within these communities there are people who don't have skills in speaking English, for example.
Yeah. But I think those, the Haredi communities, there are basically three main Haredi communities. There's London, there's Manchester, and then Gateshead. Gateshead is smaller, but Gateshead is where the yeshiva is and the kollel is, and it's therefore they call it the Oxford of English Haredi. So you have these three different communities, and each of those communities, if you are a member of the Haredi community, you have your rabbi, you have your synagogue, you have your circle. So they're one community, but they subdivide into sects is too big a word for it, but into smaller groupings. The Haredi world has been through some tremendous changes in the last 20 or 30 years, and it's going through more at the moment. You have a lot of people who wanted to leave, but who can't. They wanted to leave because, for whatever reason, they engaged with the secular world, and they saw things there which weren't open to them, and they wanted to leave and become more integrated into British culture. But they felt unable to leave, either maybe because their spouse wanted to stay, or for family reasons, or for social reasons, because the Haredi community, for all the problems that these people saw, is a very tight, very supportive community, and they didn't want to leave. They didn't want to be on their own out there in the big world. But some left, and those who left found that their families, sometimes, not always, and I don't want to over-exaggerate this, because it's not, it is a problem, but it's not as big a problem as it's sometimes made out to be in terms of numbers. Their families were being ostracized, their families were being criticized, their families were being shunned by other members of the Haredi community. That's a negative side of it. But there's a much more positive side of it as well, and that also actually came out of COVID. Prior to COVID, the Haredi rabbinates really did not want people to use the internet. The internet was treif. Yes, they might be able to use email, but they didn't want particularly their kids going onto the internet. And you could buy in Stamford Hill and in Manchester and Gateshead, you could buy internet-free phones. So you could have a phone, but you couldn't access the internet. When COVID came along, and suddenly you had to use the internet for your shopping and for keeping in touch with people, that all changed, and the impact of the internet on the Haredi world has been quite remarkable, because it's opened up the Haredi world to what's going on outside, and you now have a generation of what can you call them? Modern Haredim who are comfortable with the outside world, who understand who they are as Haredim, who don't want to leave, but are able to converse with other people, to study in higher education institutions, to be Haredim and yet be more assimilated into the Jewish world. Now, alongside that, to come back to the negatives again, you've got the small pockets of Haredim where the first language at home is Yiddish, and the kids brought up there are kept in these Talmud Torah schools, which are not really schools at all. They're yeshivot, and they're not getting a proper education. They're not learning English. They're not learning maths. But this is changing, partly because of what's going on in the Haredi world, and partly because the government is beginning to notice, and Ofsted is beginning to take some action. So you have all these changes going on in the Haredi world, and of course then the final change is the economic change, because it is very hard, particularly in London, where housing is expensive. It's very hard to have a large family and a big house and pay your way unless you are economically active. So again, the Haredim are having to go out, and of course the Haredi communities have always been very supportive to each other financially. You always had a lot of wealthy people in property and in Jewry who've supported the less wealthy. But that's changing. More and more Haredi people are going out there and making a living for themselves, and again opening themselves up to the outside world. So all in all, I think the picture of the Haredi community in 20 years' time will be very different from what it is now. A lot of people are worried that the community is going to be taken over by the Haredim. I think that's not going to happen. I think that we will continue to be a British Jewish community with different religious ways of religious observance.
And you write a bit about the Chabad Haredi community, and there is a perception that their mission is to make us all more religiously observant. But I think you discovered something slightly different.
I don't think that's their mission. I think their mission, and I think the Rebbe was very clear about this. Their mission is to engage with all Jews, to help all Jews to see the value of being Jewish, to show every Jew that everybody has a purpose in the world. But as one of the leaders of the Haredi, sort of the Chabad movement, said to me, if our mission was to make everybody Jewish, or make everybody frum, we're not doing very well. And I think that's right. They're an outreach movement. They exist in order to bring Jews in, but it's not. Yes, of course they're happy if they make you religious, but I don't think that making you religious is their aim. I think their aim is to get Jews to connect with the Jewish community.
Mm. What sort of place does Israel have in the life of British Jews? Are British Jews predominantly Zionist?
Well, I think it's changed in the last few months. I think overall the British Jews are Zionists. I mean, JPR, which is a wonderful organisation which conducts basically gathers the data on British Jewry and runs all sorts of surveys, consistently finds that the majority of British Jews are Zionists. Doesn't mean that British Jews are necessarily fully supportive of the Israeli government. They're supportive of Israel's right to exist and supportive of Israel when the bad times come. I think people are still. I don't think many people have changed their attitude towards Israel as a nation which is entitled to exist. I think there is growing fear, and you're even seeing this in the Jewish media, which traditionally has been very pro-Israel. You're even seeing now a lot of articles criticizing the new government in Israel and criticizing what's going on. So things are changing, but I think fundamentally, British Jews are Zionist, and until while Israel was still an emerging economy, Israeli charities did far better from British Jewish money than local charities. That's changed because Israel doesn't need our money in the same way now. But no, we are a Zionist community.
Now let's talk about charities, because you say a very interesting thing. Israel doesn't need our money, and yet there are charities still collecting money for Israel. Do you think British Jewish charities are well run?
Well, they're well run. I think that depends on the charity. I think some of them are extremely well run. I think the example I give in the book is of Jewish Care, which is a model charity in anybody's eyes. It pays slightly better than anybody else because it wants to keep the best staff. Its trustees are responsible and well run. In that, those Jewish charities like Jewish Care and World Jewish Relief and UJA, the big ones, are well run. There are a lot of small charities which nobody knows very much about, and they're probably not that well run. And there are, as you say, a lot of charities still raising money for Israel. Now, although Israel doesn't need our money because it is now a mature economy, Israel, like any other mature economy in the world, has social problems, has people in poverty, people with all sorts of social and health problems, and there is a need for charitable funding for those people, and it's always been part of the Jewish ethos to support Israel. Supporting Israel is a religious imperative, even though the hierarchy of charitable giving in Judaism is to give locally first. Supporting Israel sort of somehow transcends that. So throughout history, Jews have sent money to Israel, and I think the charities which are now supporting projects in Israel, they're not giving the money particularly. I mean, maybe some are, but I don't think they're giving money anymore to the Jewish Agency. They're giving money to social and welfare projects within Israel, which need money, whether it's Israeli money or diaspora money.
You describe this evolution of certain charities which seem to reinvent themselves, certainly Jewish Care, UJA. Do you think this is a good thing, or do you think really when their mission is over they should pack up and let somebody else do the work in these newer areas?
Well, I think that Jewish Care didn't reinvent itself. What Jewish Care did was it consolidated. It brought in a lot of charities which were failing, which had responsibilities, and brought it under its own umbrella. There are charities which are seem to be redundant, but I was told, and I think it's a very important point. John Boyd, who runs JPR, the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, pointed out that for many people, their small charity, their small initiative, whatever it is their expression of Judaism. It's the way in which they identify as Jews. This is what we are Jewish, and this is what we do. And if you say to people, your charity actually should be part of Jewish Care, should be part of World Jewish Relief, what you're doing is you're taking their Jewish identity away from them. So it's a difficult circle to square. But I think that, yes, clearly there is oversupply in the charity. We have far too many charities, but you can't just encourage them to consolidate, because if you do, then you're saying to people, what you're doing as a Jew is not that worthwhile. You should give up, and you're damaging their sense of identity. So it's a difficult one.
One of the organisations that is criticised quite a lot is the Board of Deputies. What did you discover about the Board of Deputies?
I discovered that I couldn't talk to anybody at the Board of Deputies.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I did eventually. I spoke to Michael Uyghur, who is the new chief executive, who's doing a great job there. But
and of course, ex-UJA at one point.
He was at UJA, yeah. That's right. No, and I said to Michael that I had tremendous difficulty talking to anybody there, and he told me what's going on at the Board of Deputies. He explained their role. I had spoken to a couple of past presidents of the Board of Deputies, but I couldn't get to speak to anybody who was, until Michael joined, couldn't get to speak to anybody who was currently in a leadership position there. The Board of Deputies is, we have this dual leadership issue at the moment between the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council. The Board of Deputies is the traditional representative body of British Jewry, but there's an issue with the Board of Deputies because it's not really representative. It represents organisations, not people. And if I belong to 3 organisations, I have 3 representatives on the Board of Deputies. And if I belong to no organisations, I have none. And I don't vote very often for those deputies, because very often they're appointed because nobody wants to do the job, so there's no election. So they're not representing people. They're representing organisations. The Jewish Leadership Council, on the other hand, is made up of all the chairman of all the major charity and religious groups. So they represent the organisations again, and they are the people who are doing the work, if you like. But again, they're not representing the individuals. So there is no representative body for individuals in British Jewry. Is that a bad thing? American Jewry doesn't have it. So, and they seem to be going on perfectly well. So maybe we don't need it. But I think that the claim that is made sometimes that the Board of Deputies is the Parliament, the Jewish Parliament, is not correct. There are no political parties there. There are no elections for individuals. There are no manifestos. There are no political stances. So, yes, we make the best of a bad job, but really, I think, and I'm certainly not the only person to think this, the JLC, the Jewish Leadership Council, and the Board of Deputies should merge. There should be some way of bringing the 2 organisations together and making them more representative.
Just a reminder to our audience, if you do have questions for Harry, please do get those in the Q&A in the few minutes we have left. And we had a question from our viewer, Howard Kleinberg. We as an organisation are based in Leeds. Leeds is the 3rd largest Jewish community in Britain, and we're hardly mentioned in your book. And I wondered if that was through want of trying or whether it had been overlooked. I mean, you write a lot about Birmingham, you write about Brighton, Manchester. Leeds is only mentioned in passing a couple of times.
Yeah, I mean, I was writing a book which necessarily has to have 250, 300 pages. I was limited on who I could talk to and what I could talk about. I had spoken about London and Manchester, the 2 largest communities, and in a sense, talking about Leeds was similar to talking about Manchester. Birmingham is going on, has been through a trajectory which I hope Leeds will not follow, where it has shrunk to a point where it really, it really is, its synagogue should be consolidating. Leeds, I think, is growing again. Certainly, Milliam is a positive thing coming out of Leeds, and I hear really positive stories about Leeds. I'm sorry I couldn't say more, but I really was limited on space.
Who funds the Jewish community?
Nobody. I mean, every organization funds itself either through membership subscriptions if you're a synagogue, or through donations. There are, in the old days, when we had the cousinhood, they funded the community. These days, yes, of course, there are a few donor families, and there are some trusts like the Pears Foundation which fund projects, but I don't think anybody funds the community as a whole. And that's a point somebody I spoke to in the book raised this. He was arguing that the community should have a central a community chest, if you like, and it should be funded centrally. I think the politics of establishing that would be very, very difficult.
Yes, I think you're right. Now, look, you've spoken to a lot of organizations and a lot of individuals, and I'm interested which organization and which individual stand out as the ones that have impressed you the most.
I don't want to get into a sort of favoring one person over another. I was particularly impressed by the Pears Foundation, the way in which they're going about philanthropy, because they are bringing in, and the model of Jewish philanthropy for generations was donors gave to charities they liked. The Pears Foundation is far more methodical about that and far more strategic about that. I think that's very impressive. I met all sorts of interesting people. I met Chaya Spitz in Stamford Hill, who runs an organization called Interlink, which is a Haredi charity which links all other charities together. And she now also runs the housing association in Stamford Hill. And she's so bright and dynamic and positive about her community that it was just so impressive. But I don't think I want to single out individuals and saying that I felt they were that they were special and other people weren't.
Talk a bit about Jewish education, because we've had huge growth in Jewish schools in recent years. Is that a good thing?
It depends on your perspective, I think. Certainly the Jewish schools are oversubscribed. They're not all oversubscribed, actually. I mean, in the areas where Jewish populations are declining, like Liverpool and Birmingham and East London, they're bringing in, they have Jewish and non-Jewish pupils because they haven't got enough Jewish pupils to fill the school. But in the pockets where there's a large Jewish population, the schools are oversubscribed, so kids are getting a good Jewish education. The question is whether parents are sending their kids to those schools for the Jewish education, or they're sending them there because they're good schools and the Jewish education is just something which they happen to pick up. The kids are going there because the parents think these are better schools. They're going to the kids are going to get better A-level grades and go to better universities if they go there. So that's one issue in Jewish education today is are Jewish schools really doing what the founders of Jewish schools wanted them to do, which is to increase the level of Jewish literacy? The other issue is, are Jewish schools creating ghettos? It is so easy these days, particularly if you live in London or Manchester, to go to a Jewish school, to go to a university which has a large Jewish population like Birmingham or Leeds, to come out of there and go to a Jewish law firm or a Jewish finance company, and to never engage with the non-Jewish world. And I don't think that's a good thing. But it's possible. You can live your whole life these days as a Jew in your silo, and I'm not blaming Jewish schools for that, but it's something I think we need to be cautious about.
Now we have a question from Jeffrey Alderman. He said, would Dr. Freeman agree that in the past half century or so, British Jewry has become less transparent in its workings, not more? For instance, who are the actual trustees of the CST? Who appoints them?
I think that we have become, in some ways, less transparent, as I pointed out with the Jewish Chronicle. That's they're certainly less transparent there. The CST trustees, I don't know about either. But I think equally in other areas we've become far more transparent. I think the Jewish Leadership Council has been a way of bringing transparency to the community, because organisations are now engaging with each other. I don't think you will ever have a community of the diversity of British Jewry which will ever be fully transparent or fully efficient or fully anything, fully dynamic. We are a hybrid of many different types of communities, and I think that's just the way we are. I wouldn't say we're more or less transparent now than before. In some places we are, and in some places we're not.
Yvonne Cheney in Southern California says, would you agree that a student in a Jewish-run school would not get a strong academic education to help outside of the Jewish community?
No, I wouldn't agree with that at all. That might be the case in some of the Haredi schools, but I think kids coming out of the Jewish schools, the mainstream Jewish schools, are getting excellent secular education and getting extremely good grades.
Miriam Moss asks, anxiety of British Jewry has been mentioned in respect of Israel and its apparent reluctance to criticize the Israeli government. Even mainstream Jewish organizations in North America have been critical of the anti-democratic leanings of the current coalition in the Knesset. It appears more muted in the UK. Can anything be done to change this? And in the view of the speaker, should it?
Well, I think it's more muted in the UK because the UK is more muted about most things. We're far more reserved than American Jewry. What can be? I don't know what can be done. There are activist groups. There are people who are protesting. There are people who are writing articles. Ultimately, these things, like everything else, it needs a groundswell of popular opinion. And how does one create that? I don't know. That I think is a question for the politicians and the activists.
How many Israelis do we have in the UK, and how do they fit in with the rest of the British community?
We have a huge Israeli community in the UK, some of whom are well integrated into the Jewish community, some of whom have no interest or connection with it at all. Again, it's like everything else, it's a spectrum, and you can't generalize. But it's certainly the case that there are a lot of Israelis here who have been here, some who have been here for a long time and have formed their own minority community in the same way that the Greeks and the Turks and every other minority has done. We as British Jews were not particularly welcoming to Israelis who came. We weren't unfriendly, but we were British. We didn't go out of our way to say hello, because that's what British people do. And Jews, Jews will always take after the characteristics of their host nation. So there are a lot of Israelis here who are not connected with the Jewish community at all. On the other hand, they are there are many who are getting involved in communal work and in charity work. And obviously they speak Hebrew and they get involved sometimes in Hebrew teaching. So again, it's it really is a mix. But in terms of numbers, there are many more Israelis in this country than one might think.
Howard Kleinberg asks, how much of the success of the British Jewish community is down to the openness of British society to be accepting of immigration and minorities?
I think a huge amount. I think that one of Britain's great strengths has always been the fact that immigrants, that refugees, immigrants can come here. I said we were the oldest established community, but we weren't the first. The refugees were coming to England long before to Britain, long before Jews arrived. We weren't allowed back in until Oliver Cromwell let us back in. We were thrown out 400 years before that. British society has always been open to immigrants and to welcoming, or at least rescuing, people who needed rescue. That's changing, and I think it's a great shame that's changing. And I think in some ways the Jewish community should be doing more to protest that change. We are becoming a more closed as a nation, a more closed society, one which is more hostile to immigrants and refugees than in the past, and I think that's a great shame. Well,
we have no more questions from our audience, so Harry, thank you for being our guest this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jonathan.
Harry's book is excellent. It's a really interesting read. And if you want to buy a copy, there's a link on our website and also in the emails we've sent you and the follow-up email that you will get from us tomorrow. And if you do buy the book through that link, Milim will get a few pennies, which will help to support our program. And to say thank you to you, Harry, I'm going to send you a book of my photography of Magen David Adom in action in Israel. I'm sorry,
lovely.
I couldn't
Thank you.
get a book with me to show you, but that will find its way to you as soon as I'm home. Now, before
That's very kind. Thank you.
No problem. Now, before we leave you, just a few words about our future program. Next week, on the 20th of February, John Hostler will be our guest. He's chatting about his new book, Jerusalem Falls. A look at the city of Jerusalem over 7 centuries and its various conquests and takeovers by different groups of people. After that, we have a number of events in partnership with Leeds Lit Fest. So please watch out for those. They're on our website now. We have Rabbi Jonathan Romain. We have the legal thriller writer Abi Silver. So that's all coming up early in March. So visit milim.org.uk. You can sign up for our website there, and that way you'll be sure not to miss anything. All of our events are free, but you can make a small donation to help with our costs. There's a link just coming up in the chat now, and you'll also find it on our website. So it remains for me to thank our guest, Harry Freedman, once again. Thank you so much, Harry. Nice of you to join us.
Jonathan, thank you for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure. I'm really grateful for you that you invited me. Thanks so much.
A pleasure, and looking forward to seeing you all again at a future event. So ciao from me.
Bye.